Okay. All right, let's talk about Vikings. Um, Vikings were not the people that we have romanticized them to be. There is a movement, especially when History Channel came out with their dramatization version of Vikings. It was called Vikings. It was on for a few seasons. They they made it a lot different than what history really was. They romanticized the Vikings. But anyway, now we're going to go look at AD 740, and the Vikings were around and affecting the church until about 1050. All right, late in the 8th century AD, strange ships began appearing in bays along the coasts of Europe, and some of these ships were quite long for that era. They were strongly built of oak, and they were 40 to 60 oarsmen that sat on the rowers' benches. They were called dragon ships, as they were usually appeared in a bay at about dawn, and as soon as the ships reached the beach, tall blond men jumped out, shouting battle cries. Armed with swords, battle axes, they attacked the sleeping villagers. They killed many of them, captured some of the youth and women, and gathered all the loot that their ship could carry. Then they'd sail away. They were marauders, pirates, and they all came from about Scandinavia, which is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The people who lived there were Norsemen or Northmen. Those Norsemen who took part in this swift, cruel raid were called Vikings. Their expression for this type of warfare was "go a Viking." It's time to go a Viking, or Vik in Norse means harbor or bay. So that's where the Vik it comes from. Go a Viking. Go a Viking. To the north and the east, they attacked the Lapps, the Finns, and the Russians. To the west, they conquered and held for generations large parts of Britain and Ireland. To the south, they occupied northern France. And in about the year 982, Eric the Red sailed westward from Iceland. He landed on the coast of Greenland and gave the islands its name. Later, he founded the first colony there. His son, Leif Erikson, sometimes called Leif the Lucky, is believed by most historians to have been the first explorer to reach the North American mainland. However, the Vikings abandoned their claim on the land and returned home. Christianizing the Vikings. All right, a young Viking, King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, became a convert to the Christian religion sometime before AD 1000. A military force that threatened all who refused baptism backed his passion for the new religion. Some Norsemen had already become Christians, mainly through Irish influence, though on the whole, the Vikings were content with their own gods. Gradually, Norway was Christianized, then the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, and finally Greenland. Leif Erikson brought the first Christian missionaries to Greenland from Norway. The Norsemen, like the Greeks of Homer's time, were storytellers and they were poets. At all assemblies, weddings, and funerals, those skilled at storytelling and reciting verses would perform. When Christianity came to the mainland of Scandinavia, the clergy frowned upon folk poems and their stories. But Iceland was protected by distance from the influence of the European missionaries. So long after Christianity became the official religion, the Icelandic people struggled to preserve their historical and literary heritage. Their religious leaders enjoyed storytelling and found no offense in it. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the clergy and scholars of Iceland wrote many manuscripts, and all were written as the saga tellers related them. Some were true, and some were pure fiction. Among the serious historical records are sagas that tell of the kings and Viking conquests. They tell of their discovery and colonization of Iceland and Greenland and their discovery of the American mainland. Now, rising power of the Roman Catholicism at this time, amid the turmoil of the Middle Ages, one institution stood for the common good, and it was the Roman Catholic Church. Many historians say that its spirit and its work during this time were great civilizing influences on the Middle Ages. By the 13th century, the church was the strongest single influence in Europe. Everyone except Arabs, Jews, and people in the Byzantine Empire belonged to the church and felt its authority. The Pope had more power than pretty much anybody else. He had more power than the kings at that time. His subordinate officials, the archbishops, bishops, and abbots, were usually great feudal lords with rich possessions and military strength. So back then, if you wanted to be an archbishop or a bishop, you had to have some military strength to you. Remember, we discussed last week that the way the system was set up, you were basically a warlord. And so these people would become the bishops. The church needed control, and that's how they got it. The church courts controlled all cases involving the clergy and church property, and many other cases, such as those of marriage, wills, and orphans. The power of the church was rooted in the spiritual force of excommunication. A person guilty of an offense against the church was expelled from it, and all Christians, even members of his own family, were forbidden to associate with him. Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV in 1076. A popular uprising soon forced Henry to beg for absolution. Because if you excommunicate an emperor or a king, everybody who falls underneath him, guess what? They have to make a choice. They have to either leave or deal with an excommunicated king. And nobody wanted to be excommunicated, so he begged for that absolution. If an excommunicated noble remained defiant, the church imposed an interdict. This closed the churches throughout the whole noble's realm. Marriages could not be performed, nor could the dead be buried in sacred ground. Few nobles dared risk the rebellious fury such a decree would arouse in their subjects. The Great Eastern Schism, we've talked about that a little bit before in 1054, but we're going to look at it a little bit more in depth here. From the conversion of Constantine, there was a vast difference between the Christian church in the East and the Christian church in the West. Here's some of the main differences that can be classified. Politically, in the East, close relationships between the emperor or empire and the patriarch. In the West, when the emperor moved away, more and the... What, did I write that wrong? No. When the emperor moved away, more and the Moors and the Byzantine folks had more power was attributed to the Pope. Intellectually, in the East, they were more philosophical, more reflective, more personal with their faith. The West was more practical, more interdisciplinary, more apologetic, and I don't mean as in I apologize, but as in a systemized way of thinking about theology and to defend the Christian faith. Liturgically, there was an emphasis on icons or statues in the East. They had multi-participation. They had leavened bread for Holy Communion. In the West, there was an emphasis on the Mass and the Eucharist, and it was centered around the priest and unleavened bread. Leavened bread is like bread you would make where it rises. Unleavened bread has no yeast in it, so it will not rise. kind of like, yeah. You ever had matzah bread? Similar to that. We've used matzah before in our, or I have in our communion services. I did a communion night once on Christmas Eve. It fell on a Wednesday. And I stayed at the church for a couple of hours, and different families would come in, and they would do communion with their family and leave. On that night, we used matzah bread, which I thought was a nice little change. Huh? We might. All right, liturgically, The East had an emphasis on icons. We already discussed that. Religiously, there was no celibacy in the East. Easter was a part of the Jewish calendar. And in the West, there was celibacy, and Easter was 2 weeks after the Jewish calendar. Theologically, the Holy Spirit derived from the Father, more emphasis on the Father. In the West, the Holy Spirit derived from Father and Son, and there was more emphasis on the Trinity. Ecclesiastically, Patriarch Primus enters Paris, and somehow there's a loose organization there. Very loose organization amongst the Eastern church at that time. However, ecclesiastically, in the West, they said that the Pope was the substitute of Christ, and it was very hierarchical. Well, remember, we had the feudal system in the West. That wasn't as strong in the East at that time either. All right. And finally, this schism emerged in a permanent schism in 1054. One indication of the future division was seen on Christmas Day in the year 800 when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor of the Romans in the West. The Byzantines, who at the time were ruled by Empress Irene, ignored the claims of the new Holy Roman Empire and the Pope. And it was Empress Irene who brought the iconoclastic controversy, the icons, to an end by restoring the use of images in the Eastern Orthodox Church. A further sign of dissent came in 879 when the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople expelled each other from the church by excommunication. So they excommunicated each other, and they didn't just do it once. Actually, they did it multiple times. Well, they both went their way. Yeah, it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. East Asia, that kind of area, and they were kind of separated due to the Moors, the Muslims. So there wasn't a whole lot of communication, so things kind of grew apart. Well, I was just speaking generally East and West there, but the East was more of the Asia Minor, Asia area, and the West was more of Europe, basically. All right. Yeah, that's a good dividing point. That's a good dividing point. All right, in 1054, there was a final schism between the churches of Rome and Constantinople. In that final schism, Pope Leo IX and Cardinal Humbert, the papal legate to Constantinople, in other words, the guy who was representing the Catholic Church in Constantinople, the Roman Church excommunicated the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Patriarch Michael Cyrillarius, thus causing the final schism that has lasted until the present day. There were times back then they would excommunicate each other, and then they would kind of come back together. And they'd excommunicate each other, they kind of come back together. But in 1054, that was the final schism between the two. Leo IX himself died suddenly in Rome on April 19th, 1054. By this time, the churches differed on a number of important doctrines, including the celibacy of the clergy. In recent years, there's been some rumors, some whispers in certain circles that the Eastern Orthodox and that the Roman Catholic Church may come back together. It's never happened, and it never will, in my opinion. I never will see that. I don't believe I'll ever see a day that'll happen till the Antichrist rises and makes one world religion. Whenever that happens. Might be. We'll see. All right. This brings us up to the Crusades. This is the next high point in history. The Crusades lasted from 1095 to 1291. And just to give you a little heads up here, they were not very successful. The cause of the Crusades. To the Christians of Europe, Jerusalem in the Holy Land was a sacred city, which it kind of is today to Christians. The tomb of Christ, the Mount of Olives, Golgotha, and all places associated with life and death of Christ were believed to have divine powers back at this time of healing and of absolving penitents of sin. People from all parts of Europe made pilgrimages to Jerusalem and other holy places. As long as the Saracens, that's the Muslims, held Jerusalem, there was little trouble. The Saracens permitted the pilgrims to come and go. In 1071, however, the fierce Seljuk Turks captured Jerusalem from the Saracens. The Turks at once began to persecute the Christians. Now, they were Muslim too. The pilgrims on their way to the holy city were robbed and beaten. The sacred places of the Roman Catholic Church were profaned or destroyed. When European Christians heard of the persecution, they were outraged. Alexius Comnenus, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, feared that the Turks might seize Constantinople itself, which was his capital, and they had already defeated and slain his predecessor. As the terror of the Turks spread, Alexius Comnenus sent a plea for aid to Pope Urban II in Rome. Now imagine that. The head of what was left of the Roman Empire, basically, in Constantinople, turned to the Pope in Rome. You know, at its height, Rome would have never thought of turning to a religious leader of any kind, because they were the dominant empire in the world. There was no greater army in history as the Romans were. But here they are, doing something they never thought they'd do. In 1095, an assembly of churchmen called by Pope Urban II met at Clermont, and that's not just down the road. This is Clermont, France. On November 27th, the Pope addressed the assembly and asked the warriors of Europe to liberate the Holy Land from them, from the Muslims. And the response of the assembly was overwhelmingly favorable at this time. This was the first and most successful of at least 8 crusades against the Muslim caliphates of the Near East, and this is when it was launched. The first crusade was 1096 to 1099. We're not going to go through all 8 of them, but we'll get some of the top ones here. Yeah, we'll get some of the top 3 here. All right. In August 1096, the first real armies of knights and princes began their march to Jerusalem. They were in 4 main companies. Their famous leaders included Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Normandy, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond the Norman. On the breast of their tunics, the Crusaders wore a cross of blood red. And those who returned from the crusade wore the cross on their backs. The Latin word for cross is crux, and from this word comes the name Crusaders. This first crusade was a grand success for the Christian armies. Jerusalem and other cities fell to the knights. Other crusades, 1148 to 1291. The second crusade, however, ended in humiliation in 1148, when the armies of France and Germany failed to take Damascus. The third ended in 1192 in a compromise between English King Richard the Lionhearted of England and the Muslim leader Saladin, who granted access to Christians to the holy places again. The fourth crusade led to the sacking of Constantinople, where a Latin kingdom of Byzantium was set up in 1204 and lasted for about 60 years. The Children's Crusade, as it was known, in 1212, ended with thousands of children being sold into slavery. They were lost or killed. Other less disastrous but equally futile crusades occurred until nearly the end of the 13th century, and the last Latin outpost in the Muslim world fell in 1291. The first of the three, looking at the crusading orders, the first of the three great military and religious orders that arose from the Crusades was the Knights of St. John, usually called Knights Hospitallers. And it was formed between the First and Second Crusades. It grew out of an earlier organization for caring for the sick and wounded pilgrims and crusaders. The Knights Templar, I'm sure you've heard of them before. If you've ever read a Dan Brown book, it's all garbage, but if you've ever read it or watched the movie, then you've heard of the Knights Templars. They took their name from the location of their headquarters in the so-called Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Later in origin and similar in purpose were the Teutonic Knights, who were mainly Germans. The members of these orders conformed to both military and religious discipline. They were soldiers with the obligations and training of knighthood. They took monastic vows. They were described as lions in war, lambs in the house, and to the enemies of Christ implacable, but to Christians kind and gracious. That was their kind of motto, what they said they lived by. They established castles, the garrisons, and hospitals in the region of Palestine. They formed branches in the home countries. In time, kings and others conferred upon these orders power, possessions, and many lands until they became important factors in European history. Their leaders were summoned to the great church councils. Their houses were used as strongholds for the royal treasure. Kings, when pressed for money, depended upon these orders for loans. Can you imagine that? An order of knights had money and power, so much so that they were invited to be a part of church councils, like the Council of Clement or the Council of Trent, or these big gathering of theologians to decide what they believe and why they believe it. You had knights in there. The wealth of the Templars appears to have been one reason why Philip IV of France resolved to get from the Pope in 1312 an order for disbanding them and for taking over their wealth. I actually watched a movie about that, about Philip IV disbanding them. It was a pretty good movie. It went into all the details and how he did it, and he basically made them seem like they were against Rome. And by doing that, the Pope finally signed the order, and they were arrested and killed and thrown out and everything else. The Hospitallers, during their later crusades, established themselves on the island of Rhodes. In the 16th century, Emperor Charles V gave them the island of Malta, and they became known as the Knights of Malta. The Teutonic Knights renewed their crusading activities in the 14th and 15th centuries by warring against the heathen Slavs near the Baltic Sea. And they combined colonizing and trading with their religious zeal and had much to do with founding Prussia. During the Protestant Reformation of 1525, the Teutonic Order was practically dissolved. Here's some consequences of the Crusades. There was some good and there was some bad. Top 10. Enrichment by the confrontation with a new culture. This influenced education, science, art, literature in the East and the West. It caused a flourishing of trade. Many new ways of communication were opened. It caused a rise of new trade towns, and consequently the rise of a new class of citizen, next to peasants and noblemen. A new zeal for the Christian faith was had. It was willing to sacrifice their lives to conquer the Holy Land. The confrontation with other faiths diminished the conviction, however, that Christianity was the exclusive and one absolute true religion. It also caused a lot of fraud in what was called the relic trade. Relics were little pieces of so-called history that they felt that the relics had power. For example, if you had the bones of a bone of John the Baptist, just touching it could heal you. Stuff like that. Metaphysical garbage. And all your noblemen would just pay a bunch of money just to possess these. And 9 times out of 10, they were fake. But because of the Crusades, it created this fraud in relics. It caused the foundation of crusading orders, which we discussed earlier. Because of the disappointing results of the later Crusades, however, the Pope lost a considerable part of his respect and authority. The feudal system weakened because many landlords left their properties for years to fight in the Crusades. It didn't just take a month or two and then they come home. They didn't have jets. Okay? They had to walk it usually because they were walking with an army, even if they had a horse. All right? Ultimately, the gap between the East and the West was widened due to these crusades because it caused the Muslims to be more militaristic than they already were, the Turks. Evaluations of the Crusades. Now, historians have viewed the Crusades as a mixture of benefit and horrors. On the one hand, there was a new knowledge of the East and the possibilities of trade to be found there, not to mention the spread of Christianity. On the other hand, Christianity was spread in a more violent and militaristic manner than was accustomed. And the result was that the new areas of possible trade turned into new areas of conquest and bloodshed. Now, there was a group of people in 1996 to 1999 of Christians initiated by an organization called Youth with a Mission, and they walked from Cologne to Jerusalem to seek reconciliation and ask forgiveness from Muslims and Jews for the bloodshed in the name of Christ during these crusades. Now, whether they should have done that or shouldn't have done that, it happened. Okay? In one sense, you could be glad that they did that because there was a lot of bloodshed. But, the Christians, they didn't start it. The Muslims did. So they were just fighting back. Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. So, new monasteries happened during this time. During the Middle Ages, several new monasteries emerged, which were limited by some of the most important people of this period. The 3 most outstanding monasteries that were established, starting with Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090 to 1153. He was a French saint and one of the most powerful men of his time. Bernard of Clairvaux led the Christian order of white monks who adhered to the strictest form of Benedictinism. And to its great growth and the height of its influence, Bernard is considered the founder of the Cistercian order and the last of the fathers of the church. After Bernard of Clairvaux, there are no church fathers, so to speak. Physically, he was a weak man, but he was a man of great spiritual insight and courage, they said. He dared to expose the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. He said it was wrong. He was a mystic. And I've got a note there that says, see Carnes, page 242 to 243. There's a book out there if you're interested. You could probably find it on Amazon or whatever. Just look up the last name, and it's all on church history if you're interested in that. But anyway, he was a mystic, and he had a strong emphasis on suffering of Christ. And although he was not considered a scholar, he wrote more than 300 sermons and 500 epistles. Francis of Assisi, that's not Francis is a sissy, but Francis of Assisi. He is the founder of the Franciscan order, and you got a nice little thing there, nice little picture. And he was baptized, Francis was born at Assisi in central Italy in 1182. He was baptized Giovanni. His father, Pietro Bernardone, was a wealthy cloth merchant. In 1202, after a year as a prisoner of war and a serious illness, Francis got tired of his worldly pleasures. He sold his property and gave the money to the church. The young man began to tend to the poor and the sick, even caring for lepers, which, if you know anything about leprosy, is highly contagious. And they wouldn't allow him around people without leprosy usually. But we know today that actually it can be cured with antibiotics. Anything that's already fallen off, though, you're on your own before Christ. When his father disinherited him, by the way, Francis supported himself by repairing chapels around Assisi. At last, throwing aside his shoes, he lived in absolute poverty. Soon he began to attract followers. And so in ragged gray gowns, barefoot, and without money, they were called the Begging Brothers. And they went forth 2 by 2 to spread the gospel of service and poverty. Members of the Brotherhood were sent to preach in France, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and England, when an 18-year-old girl named Claire left her home to follow his teachings. Francis formed a separate order for women known as the Franciscan nuns, or the Poor Clares. He's known for his so-called miracles and his sermons to animals. Yes, he would preach to animals. He was an interesting guy. In 1224, during a 40-day fast on a mountain, Francis had a vision and received the stigmata, or the marks of the nails, and the spear of Jesus' passion on his own body. He died on October 3rd, 1226 at Assisi. So he has the stigmata thing. Notice the date, 1224. And he spent 40 days fasting on a mountain. And he has this stigmata. And then he dies a couple of years later. Remember they said he was a weak man. Was he a weak man? No, that was Bernard. Yeah, he'd walk around barefoot.
Oh, I thought that was Bernard and Claire both.
Yeah, he was. Sorry. I made a mistake. If you look on the back there, and I don't know, he may have been a little, probably at his deathbed he was a little weak. I don't know what happened there, but if you look on the back, for whatever reason, there's a big old blank spot there. You've got Dominic, the last of the third monastic that we're going to look at. Dominic, they don't really know when he was born, so they guess at around 1170, but he died in 1221. He was the founder of the orders of friars and preachers. Friars preachers is what they were called. They were also called Dominicans, and was Domingo de Guzman. He is now known generally as Saint Dominic. The members of the order were mendicant friars, or traveling preachers. That's what that means. They were not attached to a monastery, which is a little different, but based at strategically placed houses in the cities of Europe. Dominic was born about 1170 in Spain at Caluriga in Castile. As a member of a religious order, Dominic went to the south of France in 1203 to investigate the threat to the Roman Catholic Church posed by a heretical sect called the Albigensians. I think we discussed the Albigensians a little bit when we were talking about heretics, if you remember that. He proposed to combat the threat by founding an order of wandering preachers. So in order to stop this heretical thing, he came up with wandering preachers. And this work began in 1206 and continued through a civil war from 1208 to 1213 that eventually killed the Albigensians. The order's 2 principal houses were established near the universities of Paris in France and Bologna in Italy. That's not Bologna, but Bologna. Spelled the same way, though, isn't it? Stipulating that they set up schools of theology. Dominic spent the rest of his life in Rome or traveling to the houses of his order. He died in Bologna on August 6, 1221. The Dominicans have produced many important scholars and theologians over the years. And I'm sure you've heard of Dominican priests or Dominican monks. They're referenced in movies, usually. Any questions? Concerns? Comments? Well, we started early.
Why were you so surprised that the Romans went to the Pope?
Or that the Romans went to the... Because if...
The Pope, at that time, they were considered the Almighty. One of the
Yeah, they were. Yeah, they were.
The Romans were basically the
Just...
first real practicing Catholicism.
Yes, they were. But when you think about it, when Christianity was considered the religion of Rome, there wasn't a pope yet. Right? And that was at the height, or coming down from the height of Rome's power. So if you were a Roman citizen at that time, even at the height of Rome's power, to think that Rome would be split apart, decentralized, shrunk, and then eventually would have to go to a religious leader for help, that would have messed up your mind. You'd have said, there's no way that would happen.
But didn't that division happen after they took over the Roman Empire? The people that took over the Roman Empire.
Yes, after the Goths.
Yeah.
Yes. They would have imagined it, but I'm talking about at the height of the Roman Empire. Somebody living at that time would have never thought Rome would have been sacked, number one. Much less that they would have to go to a religious leader for help. Think of it like in the 1950s. Nobody thought of a phone that you could put in your hand. I said 50s, not 60s. But I mean, in reality, nobody thought that could happen. They had party lines, man. You're talking about a phone you can put in your hand. Yeah, well, we still don't got flying cars, though. Still don't have many flying cars on the road.
Not on the road, but actually
Well, I know they.
they've actually, everybody knows, actually approved timelines for it.
Oh, did they really? That means somebody's going to build one sooner or later.
They want to get them built, they just don't. Yeah, they'll limit it to, I think, 100 feet.
Oh, yeah. That's not very high.
If you guys can run, they don't want to kill you.
Well, guess not.
They just hurt you.
Just hurt you a lot. Yeah. Aviation rules and everything after that, yeah. But, you know, in the
Did you ever hear with the Energy Secretary taking an electric car for a country trip?
yeah, I heard about that.
Worked out real well, didn't it?
Not really.
It doesn't real much even electric cars.
Yeah, that'd be a problem.
I agree, we're going to move that time, but the problem is, you got to have the resources and the infrastructure before you can start mandating we're going to get rid of all this stuff.
Yeah.
How safe is an electric flying car? What happens if you run out of power?
Oh, that'd be nice.
How can you nowhere near anything?
You get the little,
Land, the city's right below
you get the little battery low icon on your battery low. Find a place to land.
How many people have to load fuel and still drive?
I know, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine people.
I know, I can't.
With a battery low. Woo! That's like self-driving cars in is it San Francisco or Los Angeles? I don't remember. One of them, they just stop in the middle of the road. And there's nobody attending to them.
There's no warning on it.
No.
It's just like, you're doing 60 miles an hour,
Then they stop.
Then you're not.
And you go nowhere.
Ted was, we took out, wanted to finance all his own cars. All he has to do is repossess them. All he does is shut
Well, they do that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just close it under your door yard, puts it in a public street, and have somebody get in it and drive it back
To the place,
wherever
yeah.
it wants to go.
There's a way to disable that, I found out. And of course, it would be one of my neighbors in Paisley that figured this out, you know.
The ironic thing about it is that the BP station going to Groveland,
Yeah.
on the triangle there by McDonald's, here the guy owns a gas station, and he just bought electric car.
Owns a gas station and just bought an electric car. Wow.
So, you know, people kind of know.
Yeah. Actually, there's some of these subsidized electric charging places for your car now. They get their power, since they couldn't be on the grid for whatever reason, from a diesel generator to charge your car.
It all goes, you know, it all goes back to petroleum.
Of course it does. Coal,
I mean, here we are
oil.
talking about doing this clean air and that, and China is the worst polluter of them all.
Yeah,
They don't care.
they don't care.
Why would they?
No.
It's like, boy, you're getting that $6 billion back.
But
All they need is open up the door to people that think about traveling foreign countries being kidnapped for ransom.
yep. Yep.
They have no idea what they do.
Nope. No, it doesn't. We got off on a rabbit trail there, didn't we?
Well, Biden has,
Unsettles me a lot,
well, Biden wants to get away all the, take all the,
that they went through the Crusades and stuff like that, that's just supposed to be for Christ, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
change all the military vehicles to electric.
Yeah, that ain't gonna work in the desert.
You guys driving a Humvee halfway across the road, and you're going to go pick up, you know, air mops, and, well, we can't finish this off, why, the battery died.
Battery died in the car. Yeah. Or it just spontaneously catches fire.
The helicopter, but all those batteries did too.
Spontaneously. Have you seen these cars? They spontaneously catch fire too. And the question becomes, and I know that this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but and the question becomes, what do you do with all the old lithium-ion batteries? You know what they're currently doing with them? Burying them in the desert.
It's just a cost to replace one of those car batteries.
What?
How many thousands would it, you know, the electric,
$7,500 the average,
so,
the average cost.
and how
And
long do they last?
And they're only 7 years.
7 years. Wow. That's the average. 7 years.
I'm thinking, I've got a yard, we might have to do
Horse
horse and buggy.
and buggy.
Make sure we get one that's got a cover.
You know what car I would actually think about driving is one of these hybrid electric vehicles. Because they're great on gas mileage.
You know, actually, you know, some electric car, modified electric car, would never be a full electric, but, you know, for my wife, you know, she drives 15 miles to work. It'd be great for her, you know, plug it back in and have it charged overnight.
Yeah.
And you know, it's good, you know, good for about 350 miles per tank.
Yeah.
The new ones are anyway.
Just buy a golf cart.
200.
So quiet.
You can do 15 miles in a golf cart, right?
You can sneak up on people in those things.
Yeah, you could.
The electric bill has gone up lately.
Yeah, I know.
That's gonna go up, everybody's electric.
Once everybody's electric, that bill's going to skyrocket.
Talking about electric, what's the deal with the person's electric bill?
We don't know.
Can you do the dangerous survey?
Let me shut off the stream.